Good morning. You are tuned in to the International Connection once again. Today is show number 23 in a series on mind control we're presenting here on CKLN. And today we are interviewing Dr. Stephen Kent, a sociologist from the University of Alberta in Edmonton. Dr. Kent specializes in studying abusive cults and accounts of ritual abuse. Here is that interview. I'm talking to Dr. Stephen Kent, a professor at the Department of Sociology in the University of Alberta, Edmonton. Thank you very much for joining us, Stephen.
Oh, thank you for asking me.
And I wonder if you can briefly tell us what your background is and what is the work that you are currently doing.
Okay. I'm a sociologist of religion, and I specialize in the study of controversial religions. These are the groups that are outside the mainstream. These are the groups that are often smaller, but the groups that most people call pejoratively cults. As part of that research, I got involved in studying abuse accounts that people were providing me from their involvement in some controversial religions. By no means is it the case that merely because a group is new or small does it mean that it's involved in any kind of abuse scenarios. But certainly a lot of abuse does go on in some of these small groups. As part of that process, I was getting really extraordinary accounts about physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Then in October of 1989, I attended a conference on specifically ritual abuse. It was, I believe, a 3-day conference. The first day or day and a half was on the kind of alternative groups that I'd been studying. Then the final day and a half was on more groups oriented around the worship of something's going on, but I had, at that time, had no direct been collecting whatever material I could find on satanic allegations in the 17th century, so I had some large conceptual background. It was probably February or March 1990, when my first accounts came. This person was having memories, and she called the university about unusual religious activities wind up going to my office, so this phone call routed to my office. The person did not identify herself, and I get calls like this from time to time, so I wasn't too surprised about that. But she asked me a question about a symbol. Now, I'm a collector, and I work with a lot of religious materials. I had never heard of this particular symbol, so I asked her a number of normal questions. What was the context of the symbol? Was it on anything? Were people around? And after about the third or fourth question, I remember thinking, oh my gosh, she saw this in a ritual. Got up and closed my office door, and she became the first person to disclose. I spent a lot of time talking to her. Her case eventually led to a police investigation, but the pressure of trying to make sense out of her account led me to satanic allegations. That investigations led to the publication of 3 academic articles on the subject. And even now, 7 years later, I still, from time to time, get new accounts. There's one person I've been trying to talk to for about 6 years. I now get accounts and queries through the internet, oddly enough, through email. People hear about me and contact me and so on.
Right. When you say ritual abuse, what do you mean by that? What constitutes a ritual abuse?
The ritual abuse is any kind of systematic, patterned, disempowering violations. Ritual abuse can take place in a wide variety of contexts. They don't necessarily have to be religious in nature. Moreover, ritual abuse, the systematic, patterned, disempowering violations, can take place in any kind of deviant religious settings. It's simply the case that many of the accounts that have come to me suggest, if the allegations are true, that the people involved in the alleged violations believe that they were engaged in worship of demonic figures, what we would call satanic figures. But I hasten to add that the issue about ritual abuse can go on in mainstream deviant settings. There was a case reported in the Toronto Star a couple of years ago about a healing group in Toronto in the 60s that had collapsed unto itself and got involved in very abusive ritual abuse of children.
And what would be the ritual aspect of that abuse in that case?
Are you familiar with that story, with those accounts?
No, I'm not. But just in a general sense, if it's outside of a religious context, what is the ritual aspect?
In the allegations of ritual abuse that are, say, outside of a religious context, these kinds of abuses could involve a perpetrator who serially violates one person or one child repeatedly. In these cases, the kind of violations would be patterned, and the patterning can be important from the victim standpoint, because each time that the abuse begins, the victim knows what's coming, having been through it several times before. You hear from many victims and alleged victims that they dissociated, that they suddenly rose up to the corner of the ceiling and were gone, or that they created different personalities to take the abuse. Probably they were able to do so because they had been through these ritual patterns many times, and they know in step 3 or 4 what's coming down the road, so they escape the only way they can. And these are often children. Even adults who are disempowered can't do the normal kind of reaction, which is to either fight or flee. Consequently, these people, especially children, flee the only way they can, which is psychologically, emotionally, they dissociate.
How prevalent is multiple personality disorder of some sort among the children coming forth with claims of ritual abuse?
Well, keep in mind that I am not clinically trained, so you always want to take what I say about clinical psychological issues with a grain of salt. But my experience suggests that quite a number of people who claim to have been severely, repeatedly sexually abused as children manifest what appears to be multiple personality, dissociative identity, and so on. Some considerable debate exists in the psychological and psychiatric literature about the reality of multiple personality, and it does seem, at least my own non-clinical sense, is that some kinds of treatments by psychiatrists, psychologists, and counselors can make those conditions worse. But I am convinced from the people with whom I've spoken that what's often called multiple personality does exist in and of itself, and then that existence can stem from repeated abuse, especially for children. The first person with whom I spoke made allegations about having been ritually abused, but as an adult. It was an important case for me because it seemed very clear that she had dissociated, but she had not formed multiple personalities. My own sense about the dynamics of the formation of multiple personalities suggests that it's most likely to occur amongst people whose personalities are not well formed. That is to say, fairly young children. It's probably easiest for them to shave off and create fantasies because they're all the elements of their personality, who they are, their relation to family, to friends, their social sense of self. None of those are particularly well developed yet. So again, when adults go through systematic ritual abuse, it doesn't surprise me at all for them to say that they dissociate, forget, have trouble recalling, and so on, or have memories come back in floods or rushes that they can't control. But I don't see the adults forming multiple personalities unless the abuse happened at a fairly young age as children. And again, I'm not clinically trained, but that's what my own experience suggests to me.
And in your experience, with a lot of the people that you have come in contact with that have claimed or made allegations of ritual abuse as a child, do you find that a high percentage of these do have some kind of dissociative disorders?
Again, not being clinically trained, I can only give my impressions, but certainly it seems very, very clear that many of the people with whom I have spoken talk about different personalities, will describe in some detail the processes of dissociation. They'll give me diaries that have different handwritings. Sometimes they'll be talking to me and they'll go to different voices. I've had I remember one vivid example. I was talking to a person with whom I've been in contact for a long time, called me, and I think she was in some kind of distress. I said, I'll call you right back, made some phone calls, and returned the call in 5 minutes. And this person, who's 30 years old, had what sounded like a 5 or 6 year old answer the phone. It was the same person, but what sounded like her in a different personality. I suggested that instead of staying in her apartment all day, it was a beautiful day, and you go out in the sunlight. There's a big festival going on in Edmonton. I suggested possibly she go out to there to get her mind off these things. And the little tiny voice said that, "Oh, I can't ride the bus." And I know this person rode the bus all the time, so I said, "Why not?" And the little tiny voice said, "Because I can't read." So, and there was no indication that this person was making up these issues. In her case, she was one of 3 daughters, and a second of her sisters also was in treatment for, at the time, was called multiple personality disorder. So 2 of the 3 sisters in this family had very bad psychiatric, psychological problems. And you have to ask the question, well, how does something go so wrong in a family? Is it a genetic issue, or is it environmental? That is to say, were these, I don't know, is there a bad gene in the family, or did these 2 sisters go through fairly horrific systematic abuse that caused these personality fragmentations?
Can you tell us what similarities there are in the accounts of the survivors, especially those that the abuse happened when they were children?
Mm-hmm. There's some research on the similarities of accounts. All of them talk about severe emotional abuse, sexual abuse. Many of the accounts contain allegations about ritual murders, murders in which sometimes these people claim they were forced to participate in. Many of these accounts talk about these ritual murders in the context of sacrifices. The sacrificial descriptions almost always involve drinking of fluids out of what sounds like a chalice or bowl. It's remarkable how many accounts contain descriptions of what sounds like chalices. Some people who either claim to know or at least are willing to speculate about what the fluids are in the chalices almost always suggest that it's blood or a blood mixture. Sometimes people suggest that urine might be mixed in. Lots of stories about eating flesh, about a victim being killed and then parts of the victim cut up and given to people to eat. Sometimes these people talk about being forced to eat parts of the alleged victims and so on. Many people, almost all the accounts contain people in robes. Sometimes the robes are different colors. High ceremonialism. That is to say, there are some accounts of people being abused at the end of, say, poker games or something, but most of the accounts that I get, most of the accounts I get contain allegations of rituals where there seems to be a leader performing systematic pattern ceremonies involving daggers, often involving chants. And when someone mentions chants, I, without trying to lead them, try to get them to talk about the chants. And many of the people say, well, the chants are not in English. I just couldn't understand them. It's remarkable in those kind of small details to get these general similarities from story to story. Sometimes, very frequently, most frequently, parents, if not both, and certainly one, seem to be involved in the allegations. Sometimes relatives. That's a very quick overview scenario about the content. generally, I find that many of these accounts are broadly similar in content, but usually different in details. Now, part of what I've tried to do is to collect accounts, wondering whether accounts from independent people ever would match up. That is to say, one way of doing this kind of qualitative research is to get similar accounts from unrelated people. If you get those kind of accounts, then you have a fairly good indication that, something may have happened. It's always important to rule out extraneous external factors in the media, the same therapist, and so on. But so when I get similar accounts, or broadly similar accounts with different details, I was actually faced with a real dilemma. I mean, how could one explain these broad similarities but particular differences? And these accounts were coming from, I was getting accounts from people in various countries, and people giving accounts of alleged rituals that happened in various countries. Moreover, literature was coming out of Europe, Australia, South Africa, and so on. I was faced with a real dilemma. How could one possibly make sense out of broadly similar accounts from all over the world that were different in details? I spent months trying to figure out, and the answer, when I finally came up with a plausible answer, it was so terribly simple. One explanation is that if these groups existed, then they were all inspired by a similar source. When I tried to figure out what a common source was, I spent months going through very esoteric, arcane, occult books, and the material was so abstract that it just didn't ring true that some of the farmers or school teachers or real estate agents that people were making allegations about military personnel and so on could have understood these texts. The more plausible answer is that people around the world may have been inspired by sections of the Bible. That is to say, if one looks in the Hebrew Bible Old Testament, there are lots of discussions about the God Yahweh in competition with various pagan gods, Baal, Ashtoreth, and so on. Pagan gods, they required human sacrifice, especially child sacrifice. Moreover, in the Christian New Testament, the book records Jesus as talking a fair amount about the power of Satan. Now, Jesus always claims power over Satan, but it's very clear that from some interpretation, Satan is the god of this world. And it struck me like a thunderbolt that if people were deviant, if they were striving for what they considered to be power in this world, and they operated in a religious context, one possible interpretation is that they would go to various portions of the Bible, and whenever God or Yahweh said not to do something, they would construct rituals to do exactly what God said not to do. Moreover, Jesus talks about the power of Satan, or use a satanic image to dismiss his opponents. Then deviants would construct rituals around those satanic images. With that focus on the Bible as being a possible source for deviations around the world, for me, the mystery got solved. Then, of course, the issue became more complex. A number of religious books, religious scriptural books, and quasi-religious books have influence and impact on groups around the world. So we have different Mormon texts, different Masonic texts, and so on. And these books could be the sources of inspiration for deviance inside of those traditions. I mean, it's certainly the case that mainstream Christians, mainstream Freemasons, mainstream Mormons would be appalled at the stories that I've heard. And again, I cannot tell you that these accounts are definitive or true, but nonetheless, normal members of these traditions would be would be shocked, appalled to hear the kind of things I have. But every tradition has its deviance. Moreover, every tradition probably has sexual deviance. So if people are striving for power in this world and happen to be members of these particular traditions, it's plausible to me that they would take the images in these traditions and twist or distort them. It's also possible, too, that there could be sexual deviants who want to sanctify, to give a religious overview or hue to their deviant sexual activities. Consequently, they could offer up their sexual deviances to what they consider to be a higher power, in this case, Satan or some variations thereof, in order to give their deviations this kind of higher overview sanctification.
How do you know that people haven't picked up these kind of inspiration from the media itself or entertainment, in particular horror shows and shows about Satan and so forth? How did you rule that out from the source of this?
Well, it's difficult to rule it out definitively, but one thing I do simply ask people. Now, you cannot always assume that people give accurate answers, but more strikingly, some of the images that people were giving me are not ones that I have seen in any media accounts or outside sources. That is to say, they involved issues that the people themselves could not make sense out of. Some very obscure things. And it took me years to find what could be plausible explanations for some kinds of activities. I mean, if you like, I can give one or two examples. One example that comes to mind is a person who talked to me about having a mouse put in her mouth. And I got this account a number of years ago, and at the time I had not a clue what that could have meant. But I was fortunate to get the account on tape. Several years afterwards, Maclean's magazine had an article about a federal commission that was going across the country interviewing women about family violence. Maclean's article had about 2 sentences on what it called ritual abuse. And the 2 sentences said something like, and among the worst accounts that this commission has heard involved a woman in British Columbia. My person was not in British Columbia, who talked about having mice put in her mouth. And it went on with another statement I'll come back to. The other statement was one that the Maclean's article linked to the Bible. By that point, I had already figured out that a possible explanation was that the Bible was a source of inspiration. So I went running to my concordance and looked up mouse or mice. There it was in Leviticus, in the food laws, where Yahweh is telling followers which foods are unclean. And one of the unclean foods is mice. So, if you're trying to offer homage to a god in opposition to the Judeo-Christian God, whenever Yahweh says not to do something, you construct a ritual around it. So if Yahweh says don't eat mice, then you put mice in people's mouths in a ritual setting. The other passage in Maclean's article referred to this person claiming that she is whitewashed. She had a white, paste or paint put on her body. The Maclean's article traced that activity to a passage in the New Testament, I believe it's Matthew, where Jesus is railing against his opponents, I think in this case the Pharisees. He says something like, and you opponents are like whited sepulchres or whitewashed tombs in some translations. Your opponents are like whitewashed tombs, white on the outside but inside full of death, decay, and rotting bones. Many of my people have talked about having something painted on them, and sometimes they talk about colors, white or white and black. Sometimes they don't know what it is that's smeared on them. If their accounts are true, it could be It could be a paint to indicate that their bodies are like whited sepulchres, whitewashed tombs or gravestones, you might say. Or it could be some hallucinogenic. It could even be bug repellent, although I doubt it. Excuse me. So it's instances like that where people tell me very obscure facts that they can't make sense out of, that I've never seen, at least at the time in the media, that I've never seen in any kinds of horror shows or whatnot. Issues that make no sense to them, they make no sense to their therapists, make no sense to law enforcement officials, and yet people are convinced that these experiences are ones they've been through. It's these kind of facts that are strongly suggestive to me that they didn't get them from external sources in the media or from therapy suggestion.
This just seems so horrific and outrageous what these people are giving accounts of. And I think a lot of people will find it hard to believe that ritual exists, goes on and exists. How do we know that it's happening, or what attempts have been made by law enforcement or researchers to corroborate this, to prove that it exists or it doesn't exist?
The received social scientific wisdom now is that these accounts almost certainly do not exist. I hold a minority opinion on that issue, or at least let me say that I'm far more open to the possibility that some of these accounts are in fact accurate. When the accounts first started coming forward, they attracted quite a lot of attention in the therapeutic community as well as in the media. It didn't take too long for a backlash against the accounts to come forward. And also, I think, a growing skepticism on the part of law enforcement. Many law enforcement agencies would undertake investigations and not come up with the kind of definitive proof they would need in order to state clearly that these recovered memories were in fact accurate. Several years ago, some researchers did a large survey. I think they contacted 11,000 people in law enforcement and therapy and so on, who themselves claimed to have received about 12,000 sets of allegations. And according to the study, not one of them had been definitively proven. So a lot of social scientists would say that these accounts are in fact not true, that we have to look at other kinds of explanations for why they occur. My own case, I'm much more open to the possibility that some of these accounts are essentially accurate. I maintain this openness for a number of reasons. I'm familiar with the content and the dynamics of some police investigations. Of those investigations in which I have some familiarity, a few of them have been conducted, in my estimation, quite properly. That is to say, they got accounts, they checked them out, and the accounts didn't match. In other cases, however, I'm far less pleased with the nature and content of the investigations. Keep in mind that investigations on issues are very, very complicated. They usually involve allegations of abuse that happened years, in some cases decades ago. People coming forward with the allegations are usually imprecise about times, dates, often other people involved. Sometimes, or very frequently, the people making the allegations put restrictions on who investigators can contact because they're very panicked. I know there was one big investigation in Western Canada where quite a number of family members were coming forward with allegations of abuse. The police at one point went to the father and said, "Sir, we hate to tell you, but your daughters are talking about having been ritually abused by neighbors." Only after which the daughters had memories of the father being involved in the ceremonies. But of course, by that time, had there been any evidence, the father and his friends got rid of it as soon as he got tipped off by the police. So it's when I see activities on the part of investigators like the one I just described, where he had multiple people making allegations, and police not handling an investigation well, I know that in some of those 12,000 cases, I suspect in some of those 12,000 reported cases, there are probably some bad investigations. Now, I have done a couple of investigations, and sometimes parts of people's stories pan out, other times they don't. I had one very articulate, intelligent person who said, find this shed, it was owned by, and she named the person, look in the far right-hand corner, 5 feet over, 5 feet down, dig, and you'll find a pickled fetus. Law enforcement wasn't interested, so I went out with a reporter around the shed. We had the current owners to dig. First indication of problems is that corner that she identified had something over it that had been over it since before the time she said that she was in there. So we started changing corners, and we dug and we dug and we dug. Found nothing. We flew her out to that shed, and she dug with us, all of which we got on videotape because we were so certain we were going to find something, and we found nothing. So here he had a very clear, concise, precise memory saying, you go there and this is what you'll find, and we did it, and it proved to be wrong. So I've learned that the mere intensity with which people believe something to be true is not a necessary indication of accuracy. This harmoniousness between intensity and inaccuracy has appeared in some psychological research. But it's also the case, too, that in some of the accounts I have gotten a level of corroborative evidence which points of the accounts being essentially accurate. Part of the trouble with, say, police investigations is that police are under some pressure to get cases closed. Academics, on the other hand, can stay with the case for years. So I've got, you might say, the luxury of working on these allegations over the span of a career, whereas police officers often are on a desk or on a case for a matter of months. Moreover, a lot of the police who get involved in these kind of investigations have little, if any, background, not only investigating cases of sexual abuse, but also investigating ritual allegations. And finally, the police departments tend to be sexist institutions. They may not be the best individuals, the best type of individuals to be able to deal with the content of what comes out in these allegation scenarios. So in no way can I or should I dismiss such a large study that points out 12,000 cases, none of which have been definitively proven. But I know from the inside that investigations are much more complex than people would ever imagine, and a number of factors can go on as part of the institutional nature of police work to derail investigations. Mm-hmm. Now, if police get allegations about a murder that happened yesterday, or they find a body in a ditch, then police departments are willing to throw enormous researches at trying to solve that crime. If, in contrast, allegations are coming forward about a murder that happened 30 years ago, and there's no body, and there's no artifacts, and so on, and some of the alleged perpetrators are dead, the abilities of a police to commit resources to it are very limited.
Well, it's much, understandably, much more difficult to prove those kind of cases that happened decades before. What percentage of the cases, for example, of those 12,000 you mentioned, had some kind of corroborative evidence?
Geez, I'd have to go back and look at the study to find out. What you find in some of these, and there were also studies, by the way, done in Britain that more or less dismissed the existence of intergenerational satanic abuse, although it did acknowledge that some sexual perpetrators could use sexual images as part of the control mechanisms or the abuse scenarios in their illegal and criminal activities. But to find out exactly what percentage in these studies may have used satanic symbols, I'd have to go back and check. What you have in the academic community now are a number of social scientists, some prominent law enforcement officials, even some people in the psychiatric community who are saying that the ritual abuse allegations involving intergenerational deviance are simply not true. In contrast, you've got a couple of academics like me who are saying that we should slow down with rushing to judgment here. You've got a number of counselors whose own counseling experience inside the safe confines of their offices tell a very different story from what the larger research apparently reveals. So you've got an intense division inside the academic and therapeutic communities. This intense division immediately spills over into implications not only for counseling but for court cases and so on. So the debates are quite serious, and the consequences are quite important.
Now, I know that there's a number of states in the United States that have enacted statutes specifically of ritual abuse, and there's proposed legislation in many other states. Has there been any legislation in Canada specifically dealing with ritual abuse that you're aware of?
I'm not aware of any specific legislation in Canada. Some people would say that existing legislation is adequate. I mean, that sexual abuse is sexual abuse regardless of the kind of content or context in which it occurs. And so many people would say that no need exists for new legislation.
Have there, that you're aware of, have there been any convictions of in Canada where there might have been some ritual abuse elements, or specifically of ritual abuse? And in those cases, if there are any, how was the issue of ritual abuse handled?
Prescott, Ontario is a tragic but fascinating instance of ritual abuse, that is to say systematic pattern abuse involving intergenerational perpetrators in a community context. So there were literally hundreds of people involved as perpetrators and victims. Some small indications exist, small indications that the prosecution perhaps wisely didn't pursue, that some of the people were involved in satanic rituals in the context of these abuses. The name of the Prescott investigation, Joshua, it may have been. Joshua supposedly was a little brother who one of the young victims indicated was murdered. Police never found any bodies or bones, so they cannot be sure that this little fellow actually existed. But there was discussion that he had been murdered and that the murder had been involved in satanic rituals.
Was there documentation of his birth, or that he did
Not
exist?
as far as I know, and my information is secondhand from Judy, so you will want to talk to her about it. I have spent a fair amount of time, however, with one of the prosecutors and one of the counselors. In some ways, the Prescott, Ontario case is something of a model for the systematic, careful way that investigations should be handled.
Have there been other connections with child pornography and some of the other cases or accounts of ritual abuse that you've come across?
Well, allegations about child pornography are very widespread. Again, there hasn't been the kind of definitive proof that I would need to be able to say that these allegations are true, but I do have some accounts where people who are now adults talk about usually a father farming off the child for reasons of child prostitution when they were younger. This happens in more accounts than you might think, and I've got a fairly recent account of this activity in the case I'm working on right now. How many people have you come across that have been giving accounts of ritual abuse, and
What's your sense of how widespread this is?
I stopped counting a while ago, but it was well above 70. And these people, in terms of their contact with me, may range from a simple phone call. Many of the people eventually let me turn on a tape recorder and tape their stories. People have sent me diaries, journals, letters, and so on. I've got internet email messages, so I get contact from a wide variety of people. And again, when you ask how widespread is this phenomenon, I have to be very cautious that in terms of speaking as a social scientist, where in order for me to make a scientific statement, I have to have an impeachable evidence that I could present to you or other researchers that would lead everyone to come to the same conclusions. I cannot give that kind of definitive research, that definitive evidence. What I can do is provide a great deal of suggestive evidence, and because the evidence is still suggestive, it's very important that researchers not close the door yet on the possibility that some of these allegations are true. Having said that, with the appropriate social scientific qualifications, I've gotten reports from people right across this country, from people inside the U.S., from people who grew up in Britain. I did a telephone interview with somebody in Australia, although I believe her alleged abuse took place in this country. I've seen published accounts in quite a number of European countries and other countries, other English-speaking countries. So something's going on. Now, the critics would say that therapists in all these countries have received the same sort of shoddy training. Well, it is the case that therapists can induce or accentuate pre-existing problems. And in a couple of instances, I've seen the negative impacts of therapeutic intervention very dramatically. But again, many therapists with whom I've worked seem to be really quite competent, quite caring, and moreover quite professional. That is to say, these therapists are very attuned to issues about not leading their clients into memories, not using any kind of recovery techniques that might impede or bring into question the content or quality of what they're remembering, and so on. So, for me, the extent of ritual abuse is still an open question. It is not an open question to many of my colleagues.
Do you think there have been an increasing number of allegations coming forward in recent years, or do you feel ritual abuse of children is a new phenomenon, or?
Oh, absolutely. No indication exists that the abuse of children is a new phenomenon. If anything, I'd suggest that child abuse could have been worse in the Western world in earlier historical periods. No doubt exists that it's pervasive in other parts of the world, especially in some developing countries. What's sociologically interesting is the outbreak of the number of accounts that have occurred fairly recently. I mean, in this country, in Canada, the earliest account I've come across about alleged ritual abuse was from the Winnipeg Free Press in 1959. A person from Britain was on a speaking tour and had given a lecture, I believe in British Columbia, although the Winnipeg Free Press picked it up, talking about a child sacrifice that allegedly had happened back in his hometown in Britain. I even tried to contact him, but to no avail. Going through the literature in the 1960s, so I've done a lot of work on the counterculture religions of the late 60s and early 70s. There are a couple of very chilling accounts that appeared in these alternative press contexts of reporters I think one was in Texas, one may have been in California, going to rituals in which, in one case, the reporter said it was very clear that the person tied up was about to be sacrificed, and he fled in panic. So we've got a couple of accounts of satanic activities in the late 60s by people who wrote about it once and were far before any of the kind of debates about ritual satanic abuse went on. These accounts did not necessarily involve intergenerational satanic abuse, but certainly they contained strong indications of ritual sacrifice and various kinds of violations. Many people would say that the rise of the women's movement at the end of the 1960s paved the way for feminist therapists and therapists being more sensitive to issues about abuse against women and against children. Certainly it seems to me that a number of women finally felt permission to come forward with these accounts, believing that the therapists or the community at large finally would give them a voice, would listen to them. Interestingly, interesting and sadly, one of the accounts I've got from a man was a 50-year-old man, just terrified, absolutely panicked, who complained that he could not find a counselor who would let him talk about his ritual abuse. He said that all the counselors he ran into were working with women, and they had no experience with men, and this guy was very badly traumatized. So, people would locate the you might say cultural and therapeutic permission to come forward with these accounts in the context of the more sensitive environment for issues about abuse. Of course, there's been a backlash against issues and allegations about child abuse and about abuse against women. Groups like the False Memory Syndrome Foundation is probably the most dramatic, but a number of other organizations have claimed that parents, often men, are the victims of these allegations and these bad therapeutic techniques. It's a complex world. There are some cases in which it seems very clear that that parents or alleged abusers were in fact wronged. That almost certainly they had not perpetrated the kinds of crimes that were thrown against them. There have been, at least one, I think, a few more cases where parents have successfully sued their adult children's therapists for leading them into these memories. And there have been some cases in Ontario where therapists were using questionable techniques that seemed to induce memories amongst clients. But some of the backlash is combined with attempts to cover up. That is to say, some of the people who are involved in the denial of the reality of levels of abuse almost certainly had been perpetrators themselves. Consequently, their attempts to deny the reality of abuse becomes another form of abuse. Very nasty debates, sometimes involving extremely clever people. So it's difficult for people in the public to sort out what's accurate versus what's nonsense or what's another form of abuse cloaked in pseudoscientific terms.
Right, in an already complex issue to begin with. What is your sense of how many women versus men have been or have made allegations of being affected by ritual abuse, and how many of them have accounts that it happened when they were children versus adults?
Oh, geez. When I had about, say, 60 or 65 people, I made a count, and it's just a handful of men who have spoken to me. I'd be reluctant to give an exact figure because I'd probably omit some, but a tiny proportion of the people who've come forward to me are men. Might be some reasons for that. My general impression is that men in our culture are far less willing to go to therapy, about abuse. Men seem to have a tradition of being required to swallow their emotions, bury them, hide them, and so on. I heard of one person who would not speak to me because he had a high-profile job, and he was afraid that in doing so, his life would fall apart and he'd lose his job. So there are men. I had one person speak to me about it one time, and months later I had occasion to call him back, and he said, "I've said it once. I'm getting on with my life. You've got the account. Don't call me again." And that was his way of coping. So most of the accounts I get are from women, but it's important to say by no means all. It's important to say that because in many of the accounts that I get, little boys are involved as abuse victims. Mm-hmm. And if these accounts are true, then where are they?
Right. Well, I've also heard suggestions that a lot of the male victims of this abuse end up in jail. That they have behavioral problems because of the abuse, and many of them end up in prison. What is your sense of that?
It wouldn't surprise me, just as a general scenario, that many child abuse victims themselves, it sets them off in very difficult lives. One of the vicious tragedies of child abuse is that it steals from children the ability to build their emotions on a solid and healthy and loving emotional background. Without that solid, healthy emotional background, all other human development is very shaky. All other human development in the different stages of life we go through is built on a house of cards. It's built on a foundation where love and tenderness gets confused with other kinds of emotions and deviant activities. So it wouldn't surprise me that a lot of people who are abuse victims, not to mention even ritual abuse victims, would wind up in jail and prison and treatment centers and so on. Many of the people with whom I've spoken have had difficulty combating substance abuse of various kinds. And yet it doesn't appear that the substance abuse caused the memories. It seems more plausible to me that the memories caused the substance abuse.
Mm-hmm. And again, how many of the people you've worked with are reporting abuse as when it happened to them as a child or during adulthood?
It's interesting. One of the issues that comes up is whether the adults, when they were children and allegedly being abused, reported it to anybody. And from time to time, people say that they did in various ways. But if these accounts were, say, to a school nurse back in the 50s, the chances of that school nurse being around are very slight. The chances of the nurse remembering that account are very slight. So it's a kind of fact that's very difficult to find. I had one person, I haven't talked to her for a while, I probably will this week, who was trying to track down a family doctor because she's convinced that he knew about the alleged abuse she was going through. So getting a hold of old records is very, very difficult. That kind of hard documentation that's going on. Interesting debates or developments in the False Memory Syndrome Foundation about the issue of early confirmation. What's so extraordinary about False Memory Syndrome Foundation is that the debates swirl around a number of high-powered academics. The founders were PhDs. He was a math professor. She was a professor in an educational related field. The daughter is a PhD psychology professor at Oregon. Right. As these debates swirled, the brother of the father who was the co-founder of False Memory Syndrome Foundation, wrote a letter saying that he suspected the allegations of child abuse in the household were true. So it's not definitive proof, but here you have one family member speaking out against another in support of the adult's alleged victim. Very, very complicated issues about verification. Probably the most complicated story about verification comes in the context of the McMartin school debate.
Mm-hmm.
The McMartin school case is one that both sides in this debate use as verification of the accuracy of their accounts. As you know, a number of children came forward with ritual abuse accounts in a nursery or day school run by the Bucky family. A mother and son were indicted. I think the largest trial in California history.
This is in the mid-'80s. Mm-hmm. And
they got off. The son was retried, and he got off. Now, one of the factors that prevented conviction was what sounds like very sloppy interviewing techniques on the part of a key therapist. Nonetheless, the kids had made allegations that there were tunnels under the school. Police dug and didn't find tunnels. Now, this is very damning evidence from law enforcement perspective and from a jury. Kids say there are tunnels. You look for them, you don't find them. There's problems. Well, in the midst of the second trial, this property, the school had been sold. It was about to be bulldozed, torn down, and parents hired a private archaeologist to do last-minute digs. And sure enough, he found tunnels. He found the very tunnel-like structures that the children had been talking about. And one tunnel led into a building next door to the daycare center, which is also similar to what the children had in their accounts. He found a bag, a plastic bag that had a copyright date on it, I believe from 1986, which indicated that these tunnels had been filled with dirt sometime after 1986. So he had evidence of tunnels, and evidence that tunnels had been filled in recently with dirt and various debris, but that evidence never came up in the trial itself. Mm. So, once again, it's a very complicated case where therapists probably did a bad job of interviewing. Police may have done a very bad job of investigating because it took a private individual to find the tunnels. The evidence never wound up in court.
And since you brought it up, what is your opinion on the False Memory Syndrome Foundation in terms of the work they're doing? What do you think the effects they've had on the field of dealing with this abuse?
Some of the so-called science the False Memory Syndrome Foundation has advocated is bogus.
In terms of false memory syndrome itself?
The bottom line is that if they've served a positive function at all, it is to make therapists and counselors much more rigorous about the kinds of interviewing techniques that go on. But much of what the foundation has advocated goes certainly beyond science and enter into the realm of literal harassment. The kinds of unprofessional and I was going to say undignified, but that's probably not a term a social scientist should use, but certainly unprofessional interventions that the mother used against the daughter when she was up for promotion hearings, writing letters against her on False Memory Syndrome Foundation letterhead is beyond the pale of anything that should go on in a scientific context. It's a family tragedy as well, but it shows that the group is not merely committed to objective science, but is also objected to or committed to a kind of ideological advocacy that often dismisses contrary facts. Moreover, part of the danger of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation is that it very cleverly coined this term, false memory syndrome, which, if you talk to people in the mental health community, is a misrepresentation of what a syndrome actually is. So it's put into legal context and cultural context a very catchy word that may actually misrepresent the delicacy with which science is trying to get at some of these memory issues. Moreover, there's I've got a particular problem with at least one section of a book that a False Memory Syndrome Foundation person wrote. Richard Offshee co-authored a book, Making Monsters, and he's involved with a board of directors. I believe he's on the board of directors.
The advisory
Offshee
board.
was involved in a satanic abuse allegation case in Olympia, Washington. This is a famous Paul Ingram case. Ingram was, I believe, the third-ranking highest cop in the Olympia, Washington police force. His daughters and wife were coming forward with allegations about sexual assault and abuse, and some of those allegations shaded into satanic ones. He got arrested, and his arrest was really quite disturbing to the Olympia, Washington police. It was the buddy of the guys who arrested him.
No, sorry.
They brought in Richard Offshee because they knew of his work with so-called cults. What they didn't realize, too, is that Offshee had worked with allegations of forced police confessions. From spending time with the cops, Offshee got suspicious that they may have been leading Paul Ingram through their questions, and so when Offshee met Ingram, on the spur of the moment, he created what literature at the time called, in quotes, a, quote, little experiment, unquote. That is to say, he made up a story, gave it to Ingram, and then waited to see whether Ingram would create memories around the story. The trouble is, the story that he made up was close enough to what he had been saying that it could have been true, or at least elements could have been true. When Offshee reaches the point of writing the book Making Monsters, when he describes this, quote, little experiment, it becomes an experiment. That is to say, he misrepresents the hunch or the spur of the moment's poorly designed and poorly implemented query that he initiates and elevates it to the level of a scientific experiment. I think he misrepresents what he did, and in fact, when a judge was ruling upon one aspect of the case, the judge dismissed Offshee's little experiment for being unprofessional in design. So, there's a lot about the book one could discuss, but in terms of a sociological comment, that borders on, well, I think it goes beyond bordering on misrepresentation about what happened.
Mm-hmm. What do you know any information about some of the other people on the False Memory Syndrome Foundation's advisory board?
I do know a bit about Ralph Underwager. Now, you've probably gotten the Underwager story from many people, but Underwager was an expert in hundreds of cases, a so-called expert in hundreds of child abuse cases, always on the side of the defense. That is to say, Underwager would be the person who would claim methodological difficulties in children's accounts, would claim children were too young to know the difference between right and wrong, between lying and telling the truth. He would try to punch holes in the prosecution's charges in a number of ways, and he was testifying in cases around the world. What finally happened, a couple of things happened on Underwager. First, in a notorious case involving a repeated child abuser in Australia, Mr. Bubbles' case, the Australian equivalent to 60 Minutes just did a devastating critique on Underwager's alleged credentials. Around the same time, a New England group of social workers commissioned a study by a well-respected psychologist who's worked on child abuse, Anna Salter, and Salter systematically went through the research that Underwager and his wife, Wakefield, had published, and the Underwager-Wakefield scholarship was abysmally bad. It misrepresented facts. Statistically, it was bad. It's gave interpretations to minor points in major articles. It sometimes completely misrepresented the points of articles. Underwager essentially was doing was not doing science. So Underwager as an expert got discredited in many places, although interestingly he still became an expert in the Martinsville, Saskatchewan case. More damaging perhaps to Underwager's reputation was that he gave an interview in a journal called I think it was Pediaca. It's a pedophile journal out of Europe. I think it's out of Holland.
Yes, it's out of Amsterdam.
In which he said very peculiar things about the supposed right of pedophiles to show love to children in the way that they wanted. Because of that Pediaca interview, Underwager was forced to resign. His wife, as far as I know, still stayed on the Foundation for False Memory Syndrome. One of the people on the board whom I know a little bit is Dr. Margaret Singer. Margaret Singer has had a long history of working with so-called controversial religions, groups that people call cults. She had testified on behalf of Patty Hearst back in the famous Patty Hearst trial in the mid-'70s. Much of Margaret's work has been in the context of supporting parents, so that a significant strain of the so-called counter-cult movement, in which Margaret was intimately involved, was concerned helping parents reestablish contact, or if you will, get back their adult children who had converted to controversial religions. She had done some interviews with alleged satanic abuse people, was not convinced by them, but her involvement on this board seems to be part of her continuation of support for parents, a continuation that traces back through her involvement with the so-called cults and possibly even with the Hearst family itself. So she is a person on the board who I suspect is very well intentioned, but she's also supportive of the family. And what evidence I've read in print about the dynamics of the Fried family when the kids are growing up makes that family to be clearly dysfunctional. So I would question Margaret's judgment about her involvement, her support of the Fried parents on this particular instance, regardless of the kind of work she had done previously in fighting abuse in deviant religious contexts or therapeutic contexts.
Right. Are you familiar with Dr. Jennifer Fried's, this is the daughter of Pamela and Peter Fried, who founded the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. Dr. Jennifer Fried has written a book recently, Betrayed, and has a theory around that. Are you familiar with that, and what do you think of it?
I read it a long time ago. I really got a comment direct on it. I've got a graduate student who finished the book and is really quite impressed by it. What's impressive about what Jennifer's done is that she's taken her personal experiences and family tragedies and transformed them into research opportunities. I mean, many of us are in academics because it gives us a vehicle to get at engaging the world. It gives us a somewhat systematic and rigorous way to engage the world. And in her case, she's working on very complicated personal issues, but through the rigor of science. As far as the content goes, I haven't read the book, so you'll have to rely upon some other people to get specifics about the content and its accuracy.
Okay, we've been talking about cults and other organizations that are allegedly involved in ritual abuse. Can you name any of these groups?
Oh, now the groups. I'm not sure about the groups you've been talking about. Let me say very generally that many of the controversial groups that I hear about are involved in patterned, systematic abuse of their members, often children. Now, people always ask for names, and naming groups is very difficult because of issues about potential lawsuits and whatnot. I can talk about some of the published research that I've done, and I'm most comfortable talking about published research because this material is in the public realm already.
Okay.
I had done a study of the leader, the founder of a group called the Children of God, now called the Family, David Berg, because the group's doctrines had been highly sexualized. It was impossible to understand this group without appreciating the sexual content of its doctrines. The sexual content of its doctrines had come directly from its leader. I had published this, I had written this account. It had been accepted in a journal, The Research and the Social Scientific Study of Religion, supposed to be published by JAI Press out of Greenwich, Connecticut. The Children of God, the Family, found out about the publication before it came out. It contacted a lawyer in California. The lawyer in California wrote a letter to the publisher. An academic who had not even read the piece wrote a letter to the publisher, and a group representative himself wrote a letter to the publisher, all insisting that my article not be published, and none of them had even read it. The publisher, Herbert Johnson, did not have liability insurance for his company, and so for fear of a possible lawsuit, he withdrew the article. I had the page proofs in my hand at this time. That's how close the piece was to coming out. What I had argued in the piece was that David Berg himself had gone through some unfortunate sexual experiences as a child, sexual experiences that took place in a very restrictive, abusive Christian environment. This was a Christian environment that was by no means healthy. This environment also involved the use of corporal punishment and so on. David Berg had a great deal of sexual confusion. This sexual confusion exploded into the theology that he developed when he gained control of a group in the late 60s, the Children of God. So in essence, Berg translated his sexual confusion into group theology. People could pretty much guess what I was going to argue from the article, and so the group has carried out academic censorship. Now, the article eventually got published, but the place where it published was far less personal. What we often find in cases of controversial religions that abuse is that these groups do not have independent monitoring agencies or bodies. That is to say, the places where abuse are most likely to happen are in independent religious organizations whose leadership controls any kind of overview agencies that might look at any kind of board of directors. Having said that, however, we know very clearly that there's been a long history of child abuse in churches that have this kind of hierarchical management. That is to say, we know about the cases of abuse in residential schools by Anglicans, the United Church, and of course the Catholic Church. What happens in these instances, at least what's happened certainly with the Catholic Church in this country and around the world, is that the organization becomes committed to preserving its own public image and preserving its own financial status. Moreover, in the Catholic Church, we've got pressures inside the organization to maintain the numbers of priests. There's a real problem in the North American Church about getting young North American men in the priesthood. So to open up practicing priests to investigations by external agencies threatens just the sheer numbers, not to mention image, financial matters, and so on. So the Catholic Church in many ways has participated in cover-ups of early allegations of abuse. The church very clearly now says these policies have changed, but every now and then you hear about very aggressive tactics that lawyers representing the church take towards clients. So by no means have we heard the last about the issues about abuse in mainstream religious organizations. And I've got concerns about abuses that may be going on in overseas communities where the public ability to gather information and discuss it is not nearly so well developed. That is to say, in North America we have a press that's, despite quite a number of unfortunate constraints on it, from time to time gets out very good stories. The kind of work that you're doing now, where people talk about very controversial issues in a public forum. A lot of countries overseas don't have those kind of structures. I know on a number of the controversial groups that I study, groups that have headquarters in overseas countries or are ethnically based in overseas countries, many times children from North America wind up being sent to school overseas. When they get sent to these overseas schools, they often are separated from their parents, and they're working in environments that have few, if any, external control. So the possibility of kids getting abused in these schools is much, much higher than it would be if kids operated in a public school system.
Now, I know you've spoken about the involvement of the Masonic Lodge or some members of the Masonic Lodge involved in or being allegations towards them of being perpetrators of ritual abuse. Can you talk about how you first received this information?
Well, early on in my research, when people were coming forward with accounts, some accounts appeared about deviant Freemasons. That is to say, some of the people making allegations were indicating that their fathers had been Freemasons, and that somehow their alleged abuse they thought was connected with the lodge or Freemasons. Occasionally, abuse accounts, if they were true, and I can't say that they were definitively, but if they were true, seem to have occurred inside Masonic lodges and so on. I was really quite perplexed by the appearance of Freemasonry in a fairly significant number of accounts. That is to say, I was not getting any allegations about other kind of philanthropic or civic groups. I was not getting accounts about Kiwanis or Lions Club or Knights of Columbus or Rotarians or whatnot. It was only deviant allegations about deviants involving Freemasons, sometimes in Masonic lodges. And my sense all along is that even if some of these allegations are true, ordinary Masons would be appalled at the material that I was hearing. But nonetheless, I was faced with a dilemma of trying to make sense out of what I was hearing. So I undertook an investigation of Freemasonry. I had already published an encyclopedia about Freemasonry several years earlier in the second edition of the Canadian Encyclopedia. So I had some background. And what I found is that related to Freemasonry are countless splinter groups of these splinter groups involve usually just men. Sometimes women get involved in traditions involving high ceremonialism, elaborate rituals, and so on. So, for example, if one goes back a couple of generations, one can even find Masonic connections to a group like the Solar Temple. These are people who I often call them ritual junkies. They love the pomp and ceremonialism that they see in Freemasonry, but they want to go further with it. Freemasonry does not have a developed sense of a demonic figure in it. That is to say, there aren't these kind of rigid satanic versus God images that appear in Christianity. What I did find, however, was some mentions of Lucifer, but more importantly, a sense in some of the upper-level rituals that God was a threefold character, Jah-Bu-La, Jah possibly referring to Yahweh, Bull referring to Baal, and so on. The Baal reference is a reference to pagan gods in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament gods who required child sacrifice. So, ordinary Masons would talk about the god Jah-Bu-La and not really think too much about what they were saying, but it was plausible to me that Masonic deviants, these people I call ritual junkies, might see that in this God figure you combine both good and evil. You combine a higher God with a God who required child sacrifice. And so as part of my attempts to come up with a plausibility structure for why deviant Freemasons may be involved in these kind of allegations, I found a point of entry, you might say, in theology that would allow deviant practitioners to develop abusive rituals in the context of what they thought could be worship to a higher God.
Now, the people making allegations against certain of these deviant Freemasons, do you have a sense of what positions they held within the Masonic Lodge organization, whether they were lower ranking or higher ranking Masons?
I don't know for sure. I know that some of the people against whom allegations had been made, never proven, seem to be fairly high-ranking members. I also know that some ordinary members hear these allegations and they're in disbelief. These Masons see these allegations as being just part of a long tradition of persecution against Freemasonry because of secrecy and so on. Well, that's certainly not my intent. I have no axe to grind with Freemasonry. It's a peculiar group in the context of issues about women's rights and equality and so on. So there's ways to discuss Freemasonry in the context of male exclusiveness and so on. But I've got no axe to grind with the Freemasons at all. It's just and once I got challenged on the Masonic issues, I started finding out that there are people right around North America who have also made allegations that they have been ritually abused by Freemasons. There are a number of organizations based in the States that specifically insist that deviant Freemasons had abused them. Indeed, in Canada, there's one organization whose leader is absolutely convinced that she's the survivor of deviant Masonic abuse. So when I was able to see that the accounts that I was getting were part of a large context, a large North American context, it became even more intriguing to me about the kind of specific allegations I had been receiving.
Now, as you said, the Masonic Lodge has had a long history of being persecuted. Is there any indication that the allegations made against them may be part of some kind of propaganda campaign against the Masonic Lodge? I'm
very wary of information, so-called information, that comes out of conservative Christian contexts. That is to say, a number of conservative Christians see Freemasonry as being involved in forms of the occult and devil worship. So organizations that are related to these conservative groups and the information they put out are highly suspect. So I do my best to stay away from that kind of information. I don't get the sense, though, from most of my informants that they have these kind of axes to grind about Freemasonry. I mean, they don't seem to be involved in these conservative Christian contexts. Many of them, I think most of them, have no interpretive context to place their own memories about the Freemasons. For them, they they feel extremely isolated with these kind of accounts. They have no sense that other people in different parts of North America have made similar kinds of allegations. So I cannot place most of the accounts that I've received in a context of some sort of vengeance against the Masons.
Do you feel that the people you come in contact with making allegations have any kind of knowledge of what Freemasonry is about?
I certainly don't get that sense from people. Again, these are for the most part women, and as you know, women are excluded from Masonic ritual and practice. So it wouldn't be impossible for them to gain internal knowledge about Masonic rituals, but it takes some work. You have to go out and actively seek the information. So I just don't get any sense that these people have a vendetta, or at least most of the people have any kind of vendetta against Freemasonry.
Now, within the accounts coming from the survivors, do you get the sense that what they're telling you is in terms of the ritual specifically Masonic? Are there specific Masonic elements to the rituals themselves that come forth?
Some of the content of the ritual seems to take place in Masonic lodges. So many people talk about altars. Some people talk about black and white floors. Some people talk about pillars in the ceremonial area, and so on. So, I've had some people who have these memories and try to get a context for them, and because their fathers were Masons, will actually try to get into Masonic lodges so they can look at them and see if the lodges have any semblance, similarity to what they're recalling. Again, ordinary Masons would be appalled at these kinds of things. I have absolutely no indication that any ordinary Masonic rituals involve anything even close to child abuse. It's in the deviance inside Freemasonry, and possibly some of these splinter groups that hold the most concern for me. It's entirely plausible for me to imagine, for example, that deviant Freemasons would pull some material from some of the extremist writings of Aleister Crowley, or take some of Crowley's statements about children and sex literally, or some of Crowley's statements about child sacrifice or human sacrifice, and take them literally and build rituals around them. The Crowleyites insist that Crowley was talking metaphorically, but if it's written down, any tradition is going to have fundamentalists and literalists, people who read it and think it's true and then act upon it.
Are you aware of what the response has been by the Masonic Lodge to the allegations concerning ritual abuse, and has there been any attempt at some kind of internal investigation?
I'm not aware of any kind of internal investigations. I met with the Masons in Thunder Bay, and my impression is that what I was talking about was so far from their experience inside Freemasonry that they couldn't even grasp what I was saying. That is to say, I had, it'd be unfortunate for me to make great judgments just based upon a meeting of a couple of hours, but I had no indications that these particular people were in any way involved in anything like what I was hearing. In fact, during the meeting, they invited me to explore for myself Freemasonry, and I, declined the invitation. So I think most Freemasons say these allegations are nonsense. I've had one practicing Mason contact me just to get more information because he was concerned. I've had another practicing Freemason contact me because he saw me as part of this anti-Masonic movement and thought that what I was saying was dangerous and inaccurate. So I've had some responses from Freemasons, but not a lot. And I have some some friends, not close friends, who are Masons, and this stuff just seems to be wholly outside of their experience. But I've got repeated accounts, and there are accounts similar to the ones that I've gotten right across North America.
Well, Dr. Stephen Kent, I'd like to thank you very much. It's been extremely fascinating talking to you, and thanks for joining us in this radio series.
Oh, again, it's my pleasure to speak about a very controversial and contentious issue.
We've been listening to an interview with Dr. Stephen Kent, a sociology professor at University of Alberta. This next segment of this show is part of CBC Thunder Bay coverage of the Making Up for Lost Time workshop series dealing with ritual abuse that took place in 1994-95. We're going to hear a response to the allegations of ritual abuse against Freemasons by Peter Tooey, a Mason living in Thunder Bay area. And I'd like to thank CBC Thunder Bay and producer Don Edwards for allowing us to include this coverage in our series. You're listening to CKLN 88.1.
Joining me now in the studio is Peter Tooey. He's an active member of the Masonic Order here in Thunder Bay. Mr. Tooey, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Good to see you back.
Yeah, thank you very much. You've just heard the interview we ran. I'm sure you've heard about the conference in Thunder Bay. How much credence do you give these allegations of ritual abuse by Masons?
None whatsoever. If I can explain, Gerald, the funds that were put forward by the Ministry of the NDP government was for a workshop on ritual and sexual abuse. There's been a lady within the organization locally that's sponsoring this so-called function, and all the more luck to them. I have no objections to that. In fact, if we can have any input in it, we'd be more than happy to. But the fact that she has now mentioned an organization, namely the Masons, and accused them of a horrendous crime, I think is totally irresponsible. And I think there is an onus on the Stone Angels now to have this person come forward and either substantiate that claim, okay? Failing to do that, it's a total irresponsible, spontaneous utterance by this lady, and I'm talking about Lynn Moss Sharman.
What are you going to do about it?
I'm trying to counter it by talking to people such as yourself. We're not backing off in any way. If someone wants to know about the Masonic Order, I'm here to discuss that.
Well, I want to talk to you a little bit about the Masonic Order. Listening to Dr. Kent a minute ago, he said it was possible that individual Masons might, because of the things he's investigated, the cases he's investigated over the years, might be involved with this without any support from the Masonic Order itself. Do you see that even as a possibility?
No, I can take you to an article in the Toronto Star on January the 9th, if I can. And this is an article by Donna Laff from Boyce. She's a freelance reporter with that organization. And her bottom line says that a study released last fall by the National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect in the United States had examined nearly 12,000 allegations of satanic and ritual abuse and found not one could be substantiated. This was funded by government money just 2 weeks prior to this thing. Now the government, which is the NDP government, has turned around and given another $15,000 to fund another organization, and this same lady's bottom line is saying, so tell me, how do I get $15,000 of government money to hold a conference about something that doesn't exist?
Well, Mr. Tooey, what's the bottom line here? Why are so many people accusing the Masons of this? Of this? I mean, where's this coming from? Out of the thin air, or what? I mean, there's a lot of accusations here, not only in this province, as we've just heard from Alberta as well. What's happening? What
you've heard from Dr. Stephen Kent is that he's received reports. None of them have been substantiated, and he's the first to indicate this. It was indicated by him in his news release to the Chronicle Journal.
But why do you think you're the target? I mean, there's the Lions Club, the Rotary Club, the Elks Club. Why the Masons?
There is, and always has been, an anti-Masonic movement. In fact, at one time in the United States, there was an anti-Masonic party. This has gone by the board. I don't know. I can't speak for those people. I can speak for myself as a Mason, and by no means am I giving the official word of the Grand Lodge of Canada and the Province of Ontario or of the 8 lodges in the city. I can tell you what Masonry is about. I can tell you that they and their organizations that are involved with them donate over $545 million a year to charitable organizations. That comes out to about $1.4 million a day. And they fund things such as research into schizophrenia, to autistic children, to the Shrine Hospitals, to the Sick Children's Hospital, the Help Fund, Hearing for Every Living Person. They give upwards of, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of dollars for bursaries to university students, for Masons and non-Masons.
Mr. Tooey, do you think it would be useful for the Masons themselves to look into this at all, or to simply just to dismiss it?
The Masons are totally aware of this. It's been discussed at the Grand Lodge hearings. I'll say one thing. Masonry is a private organization, such as the Elks, such as any fraternity within the city. It's not a religious order. Its main principles are to make good people better. Okay? It doesn't profess to be a religion, although they have ministers, they have people from every walk of life that belong in. Throughout the world, there's 6 million Masons, which, if you take the world population, is a very minority.
There's I guess for a lot of people, there is a sense of secrecy about this group, that perhaps they're not as well known as the Lions Club. They're not as open, perhaps, as again, just to use an example, the Lions or the Legion, for example. How would you react to that?
Well, I don't know why you would say that. The Masonic buildings in Thunder Bay, as in any other city that are recognized by the Grand Lodge of Canada and the Province of Ontario, are well marked. You mentioned the Legion. There's the Ortona Legion on D Street, which I'm a member of. There's also the Masonic Lodge or Temple on D Street.
Well, can anybody join the Masons then? Let's put it that way.
If you have strong moral beliefs, if you believe in a supreme being, you can apply to join the Masons. It's one of the requisites that you must be 21 years of age, have good moral character. The only person I would say that perhaps can't join the Masons is an atheist, because he doesn't believe in the supreme being or God. It does not restrict membership on any basis of race, color, or creed, or religion. It's open to any religion, any race, any color.
What sort of screening process are people put through when they do join?
Masonry, in the first place, does not pursue members. The person who joined the Masonic Order must ask for an application. They must volunteer to join. When they file their application, it's put before the lodge, and it's got to be sponsored by 2 members. They have a character committee that not only interviews the Mason, but interviews the Mason's family, because it's not within our realm to take food off the table or to cause distension within the family. So what we want to know, not only from the Mason, is he able to join it, can he afford it, is his family behind him on this? And if his spouse or members of the family are a little upset, we try and urge the person to reconsider, and down the road, if things change, then we'd be glad to see him come in. Mm-hmm. But it's not within our realm to cause distension within that family union.
Mr. Tooey, do you feel personally attacked in any way about what's happened? How you respond personally to this?
Firstly, when I read the article, I was appalled, personally. And I'm speaking not only as a Mason, but as a citizen of Thunder Bay. And I base this on a few principles. Namely, if a person or if a parent hears a complaint from their child, they're bound to listen to that child and believe them, because that's within a family unit. If a person goes to a therapist and lays a complaint, the therapist has an obligation to believe that person. That's the only way they can get to the bottom of it. I have no objections with these things at all. And this is what this conference should have been all about. But when a person in a responsible position comes out and makes a public statement accusing an organization of this alleged abuse that she suffered, then I think it's irresponsible on her part if she does not come forward and substantiate that. And failing to do it, I think should result in one of two things. She should either be asked to retract it, or she should be asked to step down, particularly when the funding for this conference comes with public money.
Mr. Tooey, thanks for joining us this morning.
My pleasure.
Creating a controversy in Thunder Bay. A professor at the University of Alberta is to lead a discussion on ritual torture by Masons. Survivors of abuse can attend, so can social workers. But one Mason who wanted to attend has been told the meeting is closed to him and other Masons. Shane Judge reports.
The 4-day-long workshop starts Wednesday. It's put on by a group calling itself the Stone Angels. Lynn Moss-Sharman speaks for the group. She says there are 60 people in Thunder Bay who say as children they were victims of organized, repeated sexual and physical abuse by adults. They say this abuse took place within the context of a ceremony that had a religious, magical, or supernatural connotation. Peter Tooey doesn't have a problem with a government grant going to the Stone Angels to study ritual abuse. But the retired police officer and active Mason says he is upset he can't hear what will be said about Masonic ritual torture, especially after Moss-Sharman has said publicly there are victims in Thunder Bay.
But I am upset that an organization, namely the Masonic organization, has been smeared by this lady, and as a result I feel that we should have recourse to addressing people at that meeting and to see if this unsubstantiated complaint, if there's anything to it.
Moss-Sharman says there's nothing wrong with taxpayers' money being used to hold a closed meeting. She says it's done to protect the safety and confidentiality of the survivors.
I find it really ironic and I guess in some ways amusing that a white male secret society would kick up such immediate fuss about not being allowed into a meeting or a gathering because no one is allowed to go to their meetings or their rituals.
Moss-Sharman says Tooey can find out all he wants from the professor on his own before or after the workshop. He'll be speaking Friday night. Shane Judge, CBC News, Thunder Bay.
No, you are not listening to the CBC. This is CKLN 88.1, but we just did hear an interview done by the CBC in Thunder Bay with Peter Tooey, a Mason in the Thunder Bay area, speaking to the allegations of ritual abuse against Freemasons. In this final segment this morning is an interview with Judy Steed, again as part of CBC's coverage for the Making Up for Lost Time conference, a ritual abuse survivor workshop series put on by the Stone Angels in Thunder Bay. Judy Steed is a reporter for the Toronto Star and has covered issues of child sexual abuse and ritual abuse.
Joined by Judy Steed. Judy's a journalist with the Toronto Star, and she's first on the podium at the conference. Judy, thanks for joining me on Northwest Noon.
Thanks, Don.
How do you know ritual abuse exists?
Well, I encountered it very unsuspectingly when I was assigned to cover a trial in 1991 of a man named Billy Elliott, who's from Prescott, Ontario. And I didn't know that I was going to encounter my first ritual abuse trial, but lo and behold, the police had evidence that Billy Elliott had been in the habit of digging up bodies in the graveyard, pulling the heads off skeletons, and engaging in these kind of makeshift basement rites where a bunch of adults would dress up in costumes, disguising their faces, and they would sexually abuse children. This has all been documented. The adults all corroborated each other's stories, and they were convicted. And so that was my first glimpse into this whole concept of kind of group sexual abuse of children or ritual abuse.
Have you had your eyes open since that first glimpse?
Yeah, and I have to say I can understand why people don't want to believe that this stuff happens, because it's really frightening and horrific. But I think that if we even think about what we've seen on these airborne regiment tapes about the ways that these men behaved in groups, that this is a type of group behavior. These initiation rites are on a spectrum that relates to this ritual abuse conference and the type of activities we're talking about.
Is it with a certain group of people? Is there a certain profile on these individuals, Judy?
Well, from what I've seen so far, you're looking all across the so-called socioeconomic spectrum. In Prescott, the people were quote-unquote white trash. They were people who'd been on welfare for generations and basically seemed to have nothing to do but sit around all day and abuse children. But since I wrote a piece in the Star last week saying that ritual abuse does exist and recounting some of my experiences in my research, I've received a letter from a woman minister in the Anglican Church whose father was the leader of a cult back in the 1960s. Well, naturally, I was, we're skeptical about these claims. Mm-hmm. So I went and looked through, and this is all just kind of a breaking story I'm working on right now. I went and looked through our research files, and sure enough, 1968, there were these banner headlines about devil cult priest who had been running this cult out of St. Matthias Anglican Church in downtown Toronto, and a young teenage girl had died in this cult. Well, now I'm going to interview this daughter of this Anglican minister, but I mean, this just goes to show that here's another case from 1968 that was documented. There was a coroner's inquest. There was all this kind of publicity into it, but we all forget. We don't know that these things have happened in the past, right?
Eyewitness is critical on something like this. Did this daughter actually see her father involved in the cult?
Yes, it was a group, and she grew up. And as she said to me on the phone, that she watched the evolution of her father into this cult fanatic.
Mm-hmm. See, people don't want to believe that this goes on. How much testimony is there out there that ritual abuse actually exists?
Well, from what I've seen, because we're talking about behavior that's on a spectrum, as we know, that we can talk about the initiation rites that used to happen at fraternities. Most of those have been banned now because actually young people were getting killed. I mean, I remember my father telling me about initiation rites at Queen's University's medical school back in the 30s, and the kind of grotesque tortures, and that a young man died then. So that's kind of linked to the airborne regiment stuff, and to gang rapes, which we also know have happened. And then there was a story last week in Cambridge, Ontario, where a little 2-year-old girl died in an exorcism cult, where the mother and the father and the next door neighbors were involved in this so-called charismatic prayer cult, where they were exorcising evil demons from this little baby, and she died. So, this is another example of cult activity that's right out there, sort of in plain view, if you will.
Judy, when you get to the conference, what points are you going to try to establish with everybody then?
Well, I'm going to really just try to talk, because I'm not an expert in any deep way. As I'm just a reporter, and I've just covered stories, and so I can only talk about what I know is real and what really exists. And so I'm going to talk about linking the obvious contemporary examples that we see around us, which I think are pieces of the puzzle about this aspect of human behavior, of abusive human behavior in groups, and how peer pressure in different kinds of groups can force people who are otherwise decent people to do things that are unspeakably horrible. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's an aspect of human behavior that terrifies us. I mean, look at what happened to Nazi Germany, and there were otherwise decent German people who, because of peer pressure and because of the dominant kind of ideology of the Nazis, these otherwise decent German people did hideous things to the Jews, killing them in the concentration camps. And I think it's all part of, as I try to grapple with it myself about why we're so terrified of it and why we go into this state of this frenzy of denial, I think it's because this behavior makes us sense how thin the veneer of civilization is. And I think it terrifies us about the potential for just a kind of brutal anarchy. And, I'm trying to understand in a compassionate way what causes the frenzy of denial.
You know that this conference is already under a lot of fire, and for a number of reasons. How significant do you think the conference is?
Well, I think it's extremely important, and I think it's amazing that it's happening in Thunder Bay. And perhaps it could only happen in a smaller center, because even though Thunder Bay has received an enormous amount of publicity across the continent now, because you're hosting the first conference that I know of that is dealing up front with ritual abuse and with many other controversial subjects. And the Masonic abuse aspect is also very interesting. And I can understand again why many Masons would be very upset and feel that their reputation is being impugned. But I think this relates also to the Airborne Regiment. And, we've seen all these distinguished retired members of the Airborne Regiment saying, that the Airborne Regiment should not have been disbanded and it was a wonderful regiment. And I'm sure that there were lots of good people in the Airborne Regiment, just as I'm sure there are lots of good Masons who don't know what other Masons may be doing.
One last thought to you, Judy. Why did you agree to come and talk to the people here?
Because I feel that as a journalist, our responsibility is to really seek the truth and to shine the spotlight on aspects of society that we haven't looked at. And that's what I'm paid to do, and I'm in a fortunate position that I'm able to do it without negative repercussions to myself. So I'm happy to participate in seeking the truth about a very controversial issue.
Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Don.
Yeah.
You are listening to 88.1 CKLN, and that was an interview the CBC conducted with Judy Steed. Next week, we will hear an interview with Lynn Moss-Sharman, the coordinator of the Making Up for Lost Time Conference, and also the Canadian coordinator of XMC, the Advocacy Committee for Human Experimentation Survivors of Mind Control. Currently, XMC is engaged in a campaign to call for U.S. presidential hearings and a Canadian Commission of Inquiry into the mind control experimental abuses. Transcripts of this series are available at www.mk.net/MCF. You've been listening to CKLN, the International Connection, here on CKLN 88.1. Coming up next is Tejiendo Rebeldías.